Welcome to the Texas Talks podcast. I'm your host, Brad Swale. Today, I'm joined by the Governmental Relations Division Director at the Texas Association of School Boards, Dax Gonzalez. Dax, how are you?
Hey, Brad. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
I'm excited to talk to you. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I say this often. It's fun to talk to people on this show that, I don't know, Texas Association for School Boards. It's not always out there in the news, so it's good to talk to people like you that are, doing other things, and I get to learn what y'all are advocating for, what y'all do, what's the purpose of all this. So
I'm excited to share with you. Yeah.
Awesome. I did a really brief intro there. Is there something you'd like to add? You've been with you've been with the School Board Association, Texas Association for School Boards. You've been there for a long time.
Yeah, 18 years. Yeah.
They treat you well.
It's been a journey.
Well, I guess, right?
It's really great people, and the people we work for are great as well. The trustees across the state, by and large, really just try to do a good job. They want to help their communities, and so it makes it easy for me to want to help them out.
Yeah. So I think that most people know what a school board is, whether they vote for them or not. They get the opportunity to vote for them pretty often, really. But what does the Texas Association for School Boards do?
So our job is to help reduce the burden of government on our local governmental entities, which are school boards. And so we provide services that help them to cut their costs, to help them to provide more services for their students so that they're not worried about the associated red tape and regulations and other things that come with running a school district.
So what does that, what does that kind of look like, right? I mean, you're providing services to maybe cut costs, right? So, I don't know. I don't know the last time I engaged with my local school board. Perhaps I should do that more often, admittedly. But I don't see that, but I do pay attention to the news, especially locally, quite a bit. So what does what does that look like when you say, all right, we're providing a service for let's say it's AISD, Austin Independent School District here.
Right. Well, Austin is a very unique case in that Austin is a very big district, and they have resources to have staff to do various things across their district. We have about 1,018 or 19 school districts across the state, and the majority of those districts are small rural school districts. And so where you might have 50 people at AISD, you have maybe one at Dible ISD or Wink Loving ISD, a smaller ISD out there. So what we do are do things like we have a service called Buy Board, which is a cooperative purchasing entity, and what they do is they help provide all of the bidding process that districts have to go through to buy toilet paper.
Sure.
We do all the bidding for them to get them the best deal, and so then a small district that doesn't have the same buying power of a Houston ISD or Dallas ISD can get the same price for a certain good that ISD could get just on being their own large entity. Sure. And so that's one way. But another way is that we have several services like legal services where a district can call and ask for legal advice to see without having to call a $300 an hour attorney to provide that same advice. And so that's another way that we help them save money. We have a policy service division that helps to take all the laws that are created in a legislative session and all the different associated rules and things that go along with that, and transfer it into policy, model policy, really, that a district can take and review and cater to their needs, but they have a good starting point. And again, they don't have to go hire attorneys to translate all of that legislation into policy for them. Yeah. And like here in governmental relations, what we do is we help them advocate with before the legislature. They don't have to go hire an individual to follow the legislature for them or to engage with the legislators on their behalf. We can do that for them under the same umbrella as the rest of our services. So we just offer a wide array of services that really help our members focus less on the administrative parts of educating children and get more to the daily, actually in the classroom educating kids.
Yeah. So, a $300 attorney, I would love to meet one. That sounds like a pretty good deal, but I hear they get pretty expensive. What is the smallest school district in Texas? Do you know that off?
Oh, I don't know the name of the small school district, but I know there are like single schoolhouse districts out there that still have like multi-age classrooms because they don't have enough kids to make one classroom of, like, say, first grade. So maybe they have like first, second, and third and fourth all in one room and maybe high school in another room, because we're talking like, dozens of kids as opposed to hundreds of kids or thousands of kids.
Right. I mean, and the reason why I ask, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? But it's also, and we'll talk about this more later, but as the discourse for schools in Texas and everything, there's, sort of rural schools versus urban schools, and the representatives for those districts and all that sort of stuff, right? And you say AISD is a really big school district, and I believe you. But I don't have anything to compare it to because I don't know what the smaller end is, right? I know that there's small schools like what you're describing, but it just helps to sort of get that. What are the two extremes? There's a lot in the middle too, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like the difference between 150 kids and like, 6 or 7,000 kids.
Sure.
Uh,
I think my high school had, a few thousand, right? So that's,
yeah, yeah.
that's, yeah. So, I want to talk to you more about the advocacy part, right? So, I'm wondering, is that are you do that politically at the legislature? Are you doing it also more generally, just as you engage with school boards across Texas, like best practices? Are you advocating for them in their communities? Are you advocating them? I mean, you're talking on a podcast right now, so I mean, in a way, you're advocating for them now. Do you focus mostly just on the legislature?
Mostly the legislature and the Texas Education Association, very little at the federal level, just because the feds don't really do a lot with regard to Texas public education, aside from special education and some other Title I programs that think of your programs for at-risk kids to help them. But overall funding from the feds is about 10% of public education funding. So the bulk of it is going to be at your state level, your local level. But our job here is really to help figure out what our members want and take that to the legislature for them. So we actually have a very involved process for determining our advocacy agenda, which is our legislative plan of action. We go out to every region in the state. There's 20 education service center regions across the state. We go to each one. We have meetings. We invite all the local trustees to come in and tell us what is important to them. What are your top 5 or 6 issues? And I will tell you, across the state, those issues tend to be pretty much the same. It's adequate funding, mostly through the basic allotment. It's teacher retention. It's student discipline is climbing up a little bit in those lists of 5 issues. Support for mental health for staff and students. Those are the kind of things that really come out when we're out there talking about these issues. But after we have those meetings, they elect people locally, they elect trustees locally to come back to Austin and take all those regional priorities and make one statewide list.
Yeah.
And then once they develop the statewide list, that goes to our delegate assembly, which is about to meet here in September. And every one of our members is invited to send a delegate to amend, review, and pass those priorities, and then that becomes the agenda that we take to the legislature come January.
Yeah. I mean, so you'll have members, right? Obviously, each school board, whatever, are they all members, every single one, or is it optional? Do they pay dues? How does that work? As you talk,
so we have a membership fee structure, but our fees are very they're pretty small compared to what you might consider like in other associations.
Sure.
Like I think like the highest, it goes by like district, like their budget size and their overall size. It's a formula. It's not really my division, so I don't.
No, that's okay. I'm not looking for specific numbers. I was curious. Is it something like membership? I don't know. Is AISD, could they not be members if they didn't want to be?
Oh yeah, like I think there's only one district across the state maybe that is not a member of TASB right now.
Only one? You guys must do a lot of good advocating if only one out of almost 1,200 say no thank you.
Well, Brad, the thing is we're providing services that a lot of other people don't want to provide because they're not really profitable. So we are a nonprofit association. We fill the space for services that our members need but can't find on the open market. And so there are other entities that do provide some services, and we're happy for it. We were having a meeting earlier, and our executive director was saying that some people say, "Oh, well, you all have a monopoly on this or that," and he says, "I wish we didn't, because sometimes we'll actually tell people you might be able to find this at a lower cost somewhere else, but it's we're not in this space because it's profitable. We're in it because our members need these services.
Oh yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, it was honestly just a question of
Oh
like,
yeah.
because
Yeah.
people, Texas Association for School Boards, like that sounds like it might be like a government mandated commission or something. And I just want to clear it up for people that are listening.
Oh
Um,
yeah. 100% membership association.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, some of the advocacy issues that, as I'm looking at it, as I'm, learning more about y'all, there's quite a few, and I want to hear some of the ones that are important to you, but I also want to ask you about some of the things from your list, because there's several. Talking about locally governed and controlled school districts, sort of what that means, to if, there is sort of a marriage between the state and local governments, right? Their home rule and all those other things, and what the state is allocating the money. And so I'm curious, sort of what that means for your members, and sort of why they push for that.
Yeah, well, what it means is, you have a locally elected school board. These are individuals who have been chosen by their constituents, by the people in the community, to oversee the governance of a public school. And of course, there's going to be a framework provided by the state, and you're going to have laws that say, you can do this, this, and this, and here's some things you can't do. But traditionally, districts have operated under a kind of the model of whatever's not dictated in statute, they have the local authority to kind of to fill those gaps.
Yeah.
And what we've seen over time is that those gaps are starting to be filled more and more by state regulation and by state law. And that becomes a problem because, like I said, we have 1,019 or so districts. And when you have that many districts in that many different communities, you just don't have the same issues in every one, or what works for one may not work for another. So, requiring posting of certain information for Houston ISD might make sense because they do a lot of maybe transactions of a certain kind. Whereas out in Kermit ISD, you don't have that same kind of those same kind of transactions that are happening. So those postings might not be as frequent or as relevant. And so we really try to help inform legislators throughout the process of how different laws impact different kinds of schools. Because usually when laws are brought up, they're thinking about one kind of school, like this is for all these large urban schools are doing blank. But that's not what happens in maybe small rural areas. And so when we say locally controlled school boards and school districts, we want the community to be able to decide what works best for them. And I think you see in a lot of issues, especially like let's take back when COVID was running rampant, and you had like masking mandates, right? And different communities wanted different things from their school districts. And what really a lot of school boards were caught in the middle between federal regulations and state regulations, and they couldn't really figure, like every day was a different mandate. One day it was like you need them, the other day it was like don't do them. And really that's a situation where a local school board should be able to listen to their community and determine what's best for their kids and for their parents. And so that's the kind of self-governance that I think Texas has been founded on for years, and really allowing those local jurisdictions to determine what's best for them, for their own kids.
So, I mean, it sounds like, some of the things that you're talking about are, the posting transactions for HISD might be, that's they do a lot of that, makes sense, but Kermit, that's smaller. I think the COVID mask thing is a little bit different from that, but it sounds like it's more administrative control. Does it also go down to educational control? Like what, but how they teach their kids, what they teach the kids, that kind of thing.
Well, I think
whatever.
For some districts it is. I think for some districts you have different industry that exists around that district, and so maybe you want to offer more CTE courses or more classes that focus on on subjects that will help build that local economy better than somewhere where maybe it's maybe not as industry heavy, but so you maybe not need those same kinds of courses or those same kind of CTE and career and technical education is what I'm talking about when I say CTE. Those are your everyone always says like welding or like auto maintenance or something, but it
Which
really goes
I
deep
loved that in
into
middle school.
Yeah. I mean, but it's so much broader now. I mean, the things that our kids are, the classes that our kids are taking now are so different than what you or I took when we were younger, or what legislators took when they were younger. I think a lot of people, when we think about public schools, they imagine 30 kids in a classroom sitting with a book in front of them and a teacher telling them, what's in the book or instructing them on a certain lesson. And it's evolved so much beyond that now, where you have a lot of project-based learning, or different ways that kids can engage in lessons, but it's not just sitting there reading a book or reading an iPad. They're working with their hands and doing things that actually show them, they're learning real life examples of how things work. So the just the way that kids are taught is just so much different than what we experienced when we were younger. I know when I see what my kids are doing, I'm just really impressed at the way that they are engaging more as teams to do things, and they're learning how to work together on different issues, and incorporating different subjects into one lesson, so that it's not just a math lesson. Maybe they're learning, kind of English language arts at the same time as they're learning maybe some math strategies. And so it really is just impressive the way that we have evolved over time as a public education system.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought this up a little bit earlier, talking about student discipline, just sort of being on the rise, about something that your members are concerned about. And as we're talking about the different ways that students learn today, and I will fight back against anybody that says that, they should be on their tablets all the time. And I know that's not what schools are doing. I'm not saying that. I think my nephew, maybe like 10 years ago, had a video game class in middle school, and I was like, this is insane. Why not go back to woodwork? Whatever. I'm sounding really old, I'm sure. So as far
Hey,
as
they have teams now. There are competitive teams now that they have for gaming. It's really crazy.
that sounds like extracurricular. You should do that at home, but whatever.
Oh, well, it is an extracurricular activity. Yes.
I know,
I
but
don't think that is for credit.
I'm going to make myself just sound old, and I say that go play a sport, but whatever. That's fine. That's not what we're discussing today. So student
Right.
discipline, right? And they have iPads, and of course kids they bring their phones to school, their tablets to school, their computers to school, right? And I know that some legislators are talking about, proposing some sort of smartphone ban in schools. And I've heard different versions, and some are a little bit softer, some are a little bit harder. Is that something that has that come up with your members? That's something they would be interested in, do you think? Are they like, no, I don't want to deal with it? What's their position? Do you know?
It's something that they've talked about anecdotally. It's not something that has come up on our advocacy agenda. And like I said, we still haven't passed it yet. So that's going to be passed later in September. But that's something where, as an association, if we were asked that question right now, as our advocacy agenda stands from the previous 2-year cycle, that it's a matter of local control. That in some districts, the parents don't want their kids to have phones in the classroom. The administrators may not want it. The teachers may not want it. So let them make that decision there. But in some communities, parents want their kids to have, like, if something happens, if there's some kind of emergency, something that's going on, they want to have a way to reach their children. And so the people closest to those parents, the people closest to the ground, are those school board members, right? They were elected by those parents. They hear from those parents at school board meetings. And so they're best poised to take that input and also balance it against research that they get from staff saying, well, we see if kids bring kids to school, if kids bring phones to school, there's a propensity for blank, or scores go up or down, whatever the case may be. They're able to balance that as stewards of the ISD, to balance that against the wishes of the community. And sometimes you have to make tough decisions, and you might have to say, pass something that maybe a large component of the population may not want, but that's what they're there for. They're to take those hard votes, and to take all of the different variables into consideration before moving forward with a prospective measure.
Docs, I think if test scores are going up when students are bringing their phones to school, I think they're probably cheating as well. My guess. There's a lot of new research, tying the rise of cell phones and social media and stuff like that with a lot of mental health issues with teens. And I understand the local control argument to it, but there's a lot of things that go on in schools that does come down from the state, and there isn't local control. And I wonder sort of what makes this one different. If there really is a strong association between teen social media and cell phone use and anxiety and poor behavior in schools, whether it be, lower grades or just acting out, something like is it a ban? Is it a Faraday case that they're assigned that they have to keep in their locker room or in their classroom? I don't know, but it sounds like something that would be potentially beneficial.
Yeah, well, most schools have probably some kind of it stays in your bag while you're in class policy. I mean, that's I know at my kid's school, that's what they do. They're not supposed to bring their phones out, but my kid just started high school, and I know back in middle school, his math teacher actually encouraged them to use their phones because they didn't have enough scientific calculators to go around. So a lot of them would have to use their phones as their scientific calculator, and that's a whole different issue. But
Doc, these kids got it too easy. All right, that's way too easy. They can take
yeah.
their come on. I mean, we
Well,
had
I mean,
it's
when you're
way
doing
too.
geometry, it's very important to have a scientific calculator because
No, of
I,
course.
I took a lot of math and I cannot figure out sine or cosine without a graphing calculator.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some, adequate and equitable funding. Obviously, Texas is, we have the recapture, the Robin Hood system, and people complain about it quite a bit, especially in larger districts like in Austin. AISD, I think, is the largest payer to the recapture system, and it's not even close, is my understanding. Is the adequate and equitable funding? Is that something? Does that tie into recapture? Is there an appetite for reform for that?
Yeah, so I mean, they're two very different but also very interrelated issues. So the adequate funding component, we have to remember that since 2019, the basic allotment hasn't been increased. And in 2019, that basic allotment wasn't increased. Well, it was really just making up
Just for
for.
people that don't know, the basic
Oh, sorry.
allotment is how much. No, correct me if I'm wrong, but the
Yeah.
basic allotment is how much the state gives per student to each school district. Correct?
It is the first allowance of funding that the state provides for each student.
Okay.
So districts are funded per student, and you start with the basic allotment. So charter schools, ISDs, everyone gets that first basic allotment. And then you start adding weights, like do they receive special education services? Are they in gifted and talented? Do they are they at risk of dropping out? So that once you start adding all those other weights, that's when you start getting disparities in how much one kid might get versus another kid, from one district to the next, I should say.
Sure.
So the basic allotment is always the fairest way to distribute funds to schools because everybody gets that basic allotment. Because if you just give it to, say, fast growth schools, well, then you leave out rural schools that maybe are declining enrollment. If you just give it to kids in dual language programs, well, then you're not giving it to kids without dual language programs in their schools. And so it's always the fairest way to provide money through the basic allotment.
Okay.
So when the state cut funding for public schools by, I think it was more than $4 billion back in 2011, it wasn't until 2019 in House Bill 3 that the state kind of made a serious investment back into public education and really just filled the gap that they had made when they cut the funding back in 2011. Since then, you and I both know, inflation has risen by about 20% since 2019.
I know it every time I go to HEB.
Yeah, yes. And so schools now are having to provide the same services that they provided back in 2019, getting that same amount of money that they were. So their buying power is now reduced, right? Now, you will hear some people say, well, schools are getting more money than ever, and it's more money than they've ever gotten ever in the history of Texas. One, those aren't inflation adjusted numbers. They're just saying, raw numbers, that there's a lot more money in there. But two, a lot of that money really isn't classroom dedicated money. Last session, the bulk of the money that the state spent towards education was to buy down property taxes. That did nothing to increase the amount of money going into the classroom. That was solely to lower school district property tax rates so that homeowners could see a break in their tax bills. And that's a laudable goal. It's a worthy goal. But that was $18 billion that the state put towards that funding amount. And none of that was new money for kids. That was all just to buy down property taxes. The bucket that the state decides each school gets for school funding stayed exactly the same.
Okay.
There was some money for school safety that was provided. They did a 28-cent per kid increase in the school safety allotment, and they did a $15,000 per campus allotment. But they also required that every campus have an armed guard. Well, armed guard's going to cost between $75,000, $125,000 for not just your salary, but also your benefits, an office for a gun. This is an armed security officer, for training, for a vehicle. All of that adds up, and $15,000 per campus isn't going to cut it. So districts are having to use the little amount that they get for school safety. There are some grants coming out of TEA, but grants are not recurring funding. And when you're a school district, you need a stable sense of what you're going to get every year in terms of funding, and grants don't really help them budget well for those purposes. And so there was money put into public education, but it wasn't really for classrooms. It was for security or for property taxes or for other things. And so so that's the adequate funding part. The adequate funding part is just there needs to be more in that basic allotment to help offset inflation and get schools to where they were inflation adjusted back in 2019.
Yeah.
The part that you're talking about, recapture, is very important, because what has happened with the recapture is that districts across the state are paying more and more recapture. That money isn't necessarily going to boost public education funding. That money the state is really using that money to offset its responsibility to fund public schools. So let's say the state's spending $40 billion on public education.
Okay.
And the schools across the state are putting in, I think now it's maybe about $6 billion. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but we're getting up there. It's like maybe like $4, $5, $6 billion.
Okay.
So they put that money in there towards the state. And that money is supposed to be used to redistribute back out to schools that weren't able to raise enough money locally to fill their bucket, that bucket that the state has determined. So the state doesn't now fund school districts $44 billion the next year. They don't take that $4 billion and add it to the 40 that they had. They basically just fund it $40 billion, and then they use that $4 billion to go fund like community colleges or DPS, which are all great, worthy entities, but it's that I think what the frustration that a lot of districts have is that we're paying all this money into recapture and it's not really benefiting the system. It's just holding the system steady while the state can use the money that they're able to pull out for other purposes.
So I wonder, I mean, is the state taking your word for it, right? That the state is not, it could be doing it better. I'm sure that there's some truth to that. Absolutely. Is there something that the districts could be doing better, right? Is they have the money, they have some control over it, right? I assume. I haven't looked at the statistics for the state, but on a national level, and I'm assuming that Texas is maybe you would know better, and trust me, I would trust you if you whatever you say, but the administrative and the sort of the back end, what's it called, administrative staff, principals, that sort of thing, they sort of go up, but the number of teachers, the number of students stays kind of flat. I mean, there's a little bit of a rise, obviously, but it's not significant compared to the administrative staff. And I'm wondering, go ahead.
Yeah. So what you're seeing there, so we were talking about central administration costs, which across the state is about an average of 4%. So 4% of a school's budget goes towards central administration. 50% goes to teachers, just flat out teachers, not materials, not principals, not instructional coaches, like teachers.
Yeah.
But about 80 to 85% is staff in general, right? Education's a people-driven business. But so that 4%, because it's so small, any increase, like a 1% increase to a 4% budget is a 25% increase, right? Yeah. And that 1% could be like $100,000, right? Let's just say it's $100,000, just to pull out a number. $100,000 for that 50% for the teachers is a minuscule raise, right? Like that, it doesn't, the $100,000 to 4% is not the same as $100,000 to 40% or to 50%.
Yeah.
So, I tell people you can cut half of all administrative staff across the state of Texas, right? You cut it in half. You're saving 2% of their budget, right? That is not really enough to do much on that 50% end. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's easier to take 5% from that 50%, and that's going to equal a lot more than even 50% off 4%.
Sure. Yeah, and I see I think that what you're saying makes total sense. Is there anything? Is there anywhere else that a school district could maybe be more efficient? And I'm sure that they're big organizations. I don't know. Maybe they look at this and I just don't see what they do, and that's totally possible. But is there something that school districts could do as they
Well, I think
advocate at the state level? Sure, but also what can we do locally?
Yeah, I think getting parents involved in helping to come to budget setting meetings. They have, whenever they're setting a budget, they have meetings for the public to come and provide feedback, so that they can get a sense of what's important to their community in terms of what services do they keep and what do they need to cut. I think that's really important. Right now there's a big fiasco in Cy-Fair ISD because they had to cut a lot of their bus routes. Right now, the state of Texas is only required to bus students outside of a 2-mile radius unless there's a really dangerous intersection or something like that. And I think Cy-Fair was providing some transportation within that 2-mile radius, like within the 1 to 2 mile radius. And they had to cut those because they don't have the funding to maintain those bus routes anymore. Plus, it's really hard to find bus drivers for schools. So the parents they're now waiting in line for an hour or so. It just said that there were lines and lines of parents, and they're upset. And that might have been something that they could have gone and talked to the board and said, hey, transportation is really important to us, so let's find somewhere else to cut. But really, it's when you start getting to that point, you start talking about staff. And this has been something that's been happening for years. It's not a overnight we now have budget deficits. This is something that as inflation has increased and as the basic allotment has stayed the same, they've been cutting the fat. At this point, they're to the bone. Like, is there maybe some technology somewhere that they don't upgrade their iPads 1 year? I mean, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I know how my kids treat their Chromebooks. they make it through the year, but just barely. They're just barely hanging on when they get to the end.
Just go straight. Go back to old school, paper and pencil. Why not? Right?
Yeah, well, that's one way to do it, but books are expensive, right? Like books aren't cheap, and the state is working on some statewide curriculum materials and instructional materials that districts can use, but you still got to pay to they have some allotment for printing those materials, but you still have to make sure that it's available for everyone. And there are a lot of I'll put it this way: a lot of the rise in costs that's happening right in schools, aside from just staff, are what we call unfunded mandates. It's stuff that the state says, oh, this would be a really great idea if schools do this, but there's no funding associated with it, like having an armed guard in every campus, right? That's something that drives the cost of education, but isn't provided for. And districts have to find that from other areas of their budget. Yeah. And so it's something that districts have been working through for a while. And over the past few years, they were benefited by federal dollars that were provided. There were some COVID relief funds that were provided. And so the state was using those to help really brace against a lot of these upcoming cuts. But we've hit the cliff. And so that funding has gone away. Yeah. And so that's why you're starting to see the spike in budget deficits that districts are having to pass. And also we're trying to get the data on this. You have to literally go through and search county websites, but we think that there probably will be an increase in schools that are having to raise their tax rates. And they have to go to
AISD is going to go to the voters for an 8%.
Yes, that is correct. Right. And so there are other districts doing that now because they just cannot sustain this level of funding anymore. Like they can't sustain the same services on the level of funding that they're getting. And the population in Texas is their kids are coming in with more need. They're coming in with more severe special needs that require special education services, and so it's getting more expensive to educate kids. And it just something has to give. And at this point, it's the budget. The budgets have started to give because a lot of these services are required. Like you have to provide a free and adequate public education to students. And that is what every school district has to provide.
Yeah. I want to ask you about some of the interim hearings that have happened over the summer, as well as I think that the big thing that's going to be happening in the next legislature is probably going to be school vouchers again. And you've sort of touched on that COVID-19 money, which was a part of the interim hearings. I think for the education committee, and also learning loss since COVID, which has been a news story, I think, every year since then. Test scores are down and everything like that. And I wonder, what are school boards doing to address that? How is it? Is it they don't have enough money to address it? Is it, what do they do? It seems like a big problem.
Yeah. Well, one of the, we talked about unfunded mandates just a little while ago. One of the things that was required by the state was accelerated instruction for students who didn't perform well on state tests. And
Yeah.
so you had to have a kid, if they didn't score well, you had to pull them into a one teacher to 3 student ratio tutoring to help them catch back up. And schools did see that drop. They really did. There was, like, I think last year, last year's ratings, so that would be like the prior year's test scores did start trending upwards again, but I think we saw a plateau with this. I think we're seeing a plateau with the most recent scores. Part of that really is, Brad, the accountability system, the assessment system. I think you'll hear a lot of districts say has not remained the same. It hasn't been consistent over that time.
You're talking about the STAR
Every
test
year,
or whatever it
yeah,
is?
the STAR test, right?
Yeah.
The STAR test, the end of course test, all the state, the test that the state gives to measure student performance.
Yeah.
Anything from like the score, the cut score, which is the score that they use to determine what is passing and what isn't passing, those change. The way that they provide tests, now they only provide tests online. You have to provide the majority of your tests online. And I think it was last year that there was a huge crash in the system. And so a lot of students sat down to take their test and were even maybe a few pages in, and then the system crashed. And so then they had to start all over again because they lost all the data.
Docs, I told you, let's go back to pen and paper.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of schools would rather do that.
Yeah.
I think schools would rather provide paper tests to kids, but there are a lot of safety and security issues that the state is concerned about with regard to providing tests. So we run into issues with the state. I think districts would want to go back to a pencil and a Scantron, and actually, I don't know that they even want to do that. But if they have to give a STAR test, that's what they would prefer as opposed to doing it online.
Do they not want to do a STAR test?
Well, what they want to do is they want to have diagnostic tests throughout the year that they can select and see where their kids are. And I've talked to a lot of administrators who say, look, do you want to know how my kids are doing? Ask me. And I'll tell you how they're doing, because we provide a beginning of the year test, a middle of the year test, and an end of the year test. And it's not the same high level of security test that they do with your STAR, and they may be different brands of test,
Sure.
but they're measuring the TEKS that the state requires. The state requires curriculum standards called the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, and they provide the boundaries for what kids should be learning. And so there are companies out there who provide tests, and a school can pick the one that works best for their kids, and they want to know where their kids are. So what we found with STAR, it's a snapshot of time, right? It's a one-time snapshot. It's not measuring what that student is really doing throughout the year. It might measure what they did the previous year to that year, but it's not looking at these different moments in time over the course of a year.
Okay.
And like I said, we have a lot of kids who are really struggling. We have kids that come to school with, like, they're wearing the same clothes because they don't have clothes to wear the next day. And so a lot of schools have had to start buying washers and dryers so that kids have a place to wash their clothes and have clean clothes. Kids are having to take food home because they don't have enough food at home. So schools have to provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner sometimes so that they can eat and come to school ready to learn the next day. And these are the kinds of things that I think a lot of people don't understand, is that over 60% of kids in Texas, of students, are economically disadvantaged, and there are different degrees of that, but I don't think we take into consideration just the level of work that goes into getting those kids up to grade level and making sure they're ready to learn, and that they are learning, and that they're able to thrive.
Yeah. So let's talk about the big kahuna, the school vouchers. That was, I think, the 88th legislature. Obviously, that was a huge priority for Governor Abbott and others, and a lot of special sessions, and it never didn't really quite get past the finish line.
Mhm.
A lot of people are, more hopeful this time around, but a lot of people are still standing strong, fighting against it. What is the Texas Association for School Boards position?
Our agendas for many years now have been expressed our members' opposition to a voucher program, primarily because of the lack of accountability and transparency that would come with such a program. None of the bills that we have seen have adequate accountability to make sure that if a kid is leaving the public education system, are they being served well? Are they learning? Because what we've seen in other states is that especially your economically disadvantaged kids will go to use a voucher and then come back a year later further behind than when they left, because they haven't been getting the services that they need. We worry about special education services being provided to kids. Private schools, you'll hear that private schools provide special education services, and they may, but there's a difference between services for kids with dyslexia and for kids who are paraplegics or require constant medical attention.
Sure.
That is a huge spectrum. And so they can, you can say that someone provides special education services, but it's not the kind. In fact, what will happen a lot of times is private schools will contract with public schools to provide those more intensive special education services. And so I think a lot of the angst with vouchers among educators and among school board members comes from this this giving away of money that has no financial transparency, no educational transparency or accountability associated with it, in a time when we are so careful to test every single student with a STAR test, and we have 50 different reports that the schools have to post regarding their finances. And there's a first rating, the financial integrity rating system of Texas, that they use to rate how well schools run their finances. And yet we'll take that money and just give it away and hope that everything goes well. And so I think those are the kind of things that really that educators and school board members have a hard time accepting with a voucher program.
If there was some sort of negotiation process and all this, which is, how bills are made oftentimes, right? If the private or homeschool or whatever the voucher might be used for, whatever organization it goes to, if they also had to do some sort of STAR test or something like that, would that ease some of the reservations that your members have?
I've heard some members say that they would like to see that kind of accountability associated with any program, but I've also heard that accountability is a non-starter for the any legislation regarding vouchers. So there was a bill that was potentially floated in the House last session that would have required kids taking a voucher to take some kind of norm reference test or maybe the STAR test. And the governor said he wouldn't support that bill, and so the bill was never even really heard in committee. So while and like I said, there's a spectrum. You have some trustees who are just, nope, we don't want to see that at all. We have other trustees there's probably a few trustees out there. I don't think there are a lot, but there are probably a few who wouldn't mind seeing a voucher program. I think it's a very small percentage. I mean, I've been doing this for 18 years, Brad, and I've talked to hundreds of trustees over my time, and I think the ones who support it, I maybe talked to maybe 3 or 4 in that whole time. But of the ones who were opposed, there is a spectrum between those who would like, well, maybe, but if there was some kind of accountability and transparency, and then there are those who say, no, it's going to draw too much funding away from public schools, which we've seen in other states. If you only have one pie for education funding, that money that you're using for vouchers may not come out of TEA, but it's coming out of money that the state has dedicated for education. And
Yeah.
so in a time where, like I said, districts are having to cut bus routes, cut teachers, cut programs, raise fees for extracurricular activities. I think it hurts the education community to see that we're going to give $1 billion away to a voucher program. Because while the plan was 500 million last session, that was only for 1 year. So that plan automatically becomes a $1 billion program over from one fiscal year to the next.
Sure. There's obviously, there's the state has a rating system like D and F rated schools, right? And I was reading just the other day, the Austin Independent School District, I think 6 out of 10 students at the third grade STAR test,
Mhm.
they don't read it at grade level. right? And some of them might just be right there. Some of them may be just totally not they way left behind, right? And
Mhm.
that's a really sad situation. So, for parents that are stuck in the D or F rated schools, they're not happy because they're, one of those 6 and 10. What do members say to those families that are saying, because that's the argument, right? That's
Yeah,
the counter argument is, parents need a choice when they're in a failing school, right? And
yeah,
they
and I
can't
think
afford a private school
there
or
are a lot of components to that, but I think one thing is the problem with school choice with
sure.
vouchers is that it really isn't parental choice. It's school choice. There no provision in the bill requires a private school to take a kid with a voucher,
Okay.
right? It's the school's option whether or not they accept a child with a voucher. And so when you have a system like that, what kids is the private school going to take, right?
Yeah.
Like they're going to take the kids who are already doing well. And we see that with some charter schools that they don't they don't explicitly screen children, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence of saying, well, your kid might not do very well here because we have kind of an advanced program, so you might be better off in another school. ISDs have to provide a space for a child. If a child moves into that attendance zone, you have to provide a space. They are the safety net. They are the ones serving more than 90% of kids across the state of Texas. We need to get that system right. That is a system that we need to focus on to make sure that every child has access to a good school. If there's a school that's a D or F rated school, then TA's job should be to go and help them get the resources to fix that school, not punish the school and make it harder for them to improve their performance. And as we've seen, as I told you, the inflation adjusted dollars, inflation adjusted support for schools has been dropping consistently over time. We can't expect to be giving fewer resources to schools and to have them give better results.
Mhm.
Like that's lunacy. Like that doesn't jive. And so money for property taxes doesn't equal money for education,
Yeah.
right? And so we need to target these schools that are struggling and help these kids do better. If there's a case where you can have a school come in and help improve that, whether it's a charter school or private school, we haven't really seen that bear out. That hasn't happened in other states. What we're seeing are schools pop up in A-rated attendance zones in school and where they have charters. The story I always tell is I'm from South Texas. I'm from the Valley.
Okay.
And on my way to visit my mom, there is a blue ribbon, blue ribbon is a nationally recognized award that schools can get. A blue ribbon school, it's in the middle of like a cornfield, right? It's like there's nothing out there. So they're dealing with kids who are likely impoverished, who are economically disadvantaged
Yep.
and need support the most, and they are doing well, so well that they're a blue ribbon school. The valley is growing; it's exploding. There are people building houses everywhere, and across the street, a new gated community has gone up, and that gated community has a charter school that's opening. So you're having a situation where a charter school is opening right across the street from a top rated blue ribbon school, but they're within the gated community.
Sure.
So those nice new houses that are going up that are the doctors and the lawyers, where do you think they're going to send their kids? Are they going to send their kids across the street, or they don't even have to leave the gated community? They can go right there. And so it's that duplication of services that we're seeing through school choice. We're not seeing there are some very top performing charter schools that are going into impoverished areas, but that's not the norm. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing the kids whose parents are engaged, the kids who are already doing well. When a charter school opened up in my neighborhood, when I was in school, the first thing they did was they came and they asked for the list of top 10 students. Like, who are your top, I want to see your top 10 students, because those are the kids we want to go after, not
Sure.
your bottom 10 kids. And so I think that's another thing that is troubling for a lot of educators is it's not the same. We're not on the same level playing field. And so if there was some kind of school choice, it would be nice to see parents having the ability to say, I want to go to the school. I have now a voucher. I would like to see my child get into the school, and I don't want to pay more than the voucher,
Yeah.
right? But most private schools, the top tier private schools, would not participate in that kind of program. And really, what we've seen is that in other states that have done voucher programs, the number of schools that have opened and closed, I think it was, where was it? Was it in, oh, I don't remember the state now. But it was like 40% of schools that had opened when the vouchers were created had already closed.
Sure.
So you see a lot of churn happening, and when they close, there's no responsibility to the student. They just close and say we can't serve you all anymore, and the students are now held, left holding the bag, and they end up back in the public school. And so I think that's what we're trying to prevent. We want to make sure that let's fix the public education system, make sure that's ready, and then we can look at expansions and doing other things. But if we're not even making sure that every kid has a safe and adequate place to go, I think we're missing the boat.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. That's a lot. I want to be respectful of your time. So again, I appreciate you coming on and talking about all this stuff and talking about it very openly. Dax Gonzalez, the Governmental Relations Division Director at the Texas Association for School Boards. Is there a website, social media you want to plug?
TASB.org. That's our main website.
TASB.org. All right, we'll put that down in the description. Dax Gonzalez, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.